Welcome to Revenge Stories. I knew something was wrong the moment James set the coffee cup in front of me. It wasn't just the way he smiled, that tight, forced stretch of his lips that never quite reached his eyes. It wasn't even the way his sister, Nina, stirred her own coffee absently, her gaze flicking between us like she was watching a scene she had orchestrated play out exactly as she intended. It was the smell. Something metallic, something bitter, something wrong. The scent curled up from the surface of the coffee like an omen, slipping into my nostrils, triggering something deep inside me: instinct, memory, fear. I'd smelled this before. Not here, not now, but weeks ago, when I'd woken up in an emergency room, my stomach twisted in agony, my vision blurred from the fourth drip they had pumped into my veins to flush out whatever had made me collapse after dinner at Nina's house. They had laughed it off, of course. Food poisoning, James had said, shaking his head with a rueful smile. You always have such a sensitive stomach, honey. Nina had smiled, that same knowing smile she wore now. Poor thing. Maybe you should start eating healthier. I had wanted to believe them. But now, sitting in her impeccably decorated dining room, watching them watch me, I knew better. This wasn't an accident. It never had been. Don't you want to try it? James asked, his voice so sweet. It felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. I made it just for you. I forced a smile, my fingers tightening around the ceramic handle. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, a rhythm of warning. If I drank this, I wouldn't be leaving this table the same way I had come. If I drank this, I might not leave at all. I took a slow breath, my mind spinning through every moment that had led to this one. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of slowly unraveling who James really was beneath the charming veneer. 3 years of being gaslit, of being made to feel paranoid, overreactive, hysterical. The accidents had started small seasonings in my food that I was allergic to, drinks that left me nauseous for hours, strange bouts of dizziness that only happened after sharing meals with my husband or his sister. And yet, somehow, it had always been my fault. I was careless. I was dramatic. I was imagining things. Even when the doctors found traces of something unusual in my system last month, James had held my hand, looked me in the eye, and told me it must have been an expired supplement I took without realizing. I had wanted to believe him, until now. Nina's voice sliced through the tense silence. James has become quite the barista lately, she said, amusement threading through her words. He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you. For you. The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. My grip on the cup tightened. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, expecting. But I wasn't the same woman I had been 3 years ago. I wasn't the naive, trusting wife who took everything at face value. I had been keeping notes, gathering proof, watching them just as closely as they had been watching me. And today, I had come prepared. I set the cup down carefully, forcing a distracted smile as I reached for my phone. Oh, I just remembered I need to make a quick call for work. Nina, do you mind if I use your study? Nina's expression flickered, but only for a moment. Then she waved a hand dismissively. Just don't mess up anything important. I stood, the chair legs scraping against the polished floor. As I turned, I let myself stumble just enough to make it look clumsy, just enough to reach out for balance. My fingers brushed against her cup, knocking it slightly as I steadied myself. A perfectly innocent accident. Or so it seemed. Oh, sorry, I murmured, swapping our cups in the commotion. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. Nina rolled her eyes. You really are a klutz. I gave her a sheepish smile before walking toward the study, my hands trembling at my sides. As soon as I was out of sight, I positioned myself by the door, my breath shallow, my hands clenched into fists, my ears strained for the sound I both dreaded and needed to hear: the scrape of ceramic, a sip, a pause. Then, the sharp intake of breath, the sound of something clattering against the table, the scrape of a chair, a choked, gasping sound that sent a bolt of adrenaline through my body. James's voice suddenly panicked. Nina? I stepped back into the doorway, my phone already recording. Nina's hands were trembling. Her face had lost all color. Her breathing was ragged. her fingers clutching at the table's edge like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. James's eyes snapped to me, his face a mask of horror. What did you do? I tilted my head, my voice smooth, controlled. I was just about to ask you the same thing. Nina let out a strangled gasp, her body convulsing slightly. Her hands trembled violently as she gripped James's arm. James, she wheezed, something's wrong. He was frozen, his mouth opening and closing, searching for an explanation, an escape. But there was none. I held up my phone, letting him see the red recording light blinking. You said it was just for me, remember? My voice was eerily calm, even as my blood thundered in my veins. So, tell me, James, what exactly did you put in that coffee? His face crumpled, the weight of realization hitting him all at once. He had lost. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Because this time, I wasn't the one being poisoned. This time, I was the one holding the cup. James lunged for the cup, knocking it over in his panic. Dark liquid splattered across the pristine white tablecloth, seeping into the expensive fabric like a spreading stain of guilt. His hands trembled as he reached for Nina, whose breath was now coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. Her fingers clawed at her throat, eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered terror. Christina! James's voice was a hoarse whisper, his pupils blown wide with panic. Call an ambulance. I didn't move. I stood there, my phone steady in my hand, capturing every second of their carefully laid plan unraveling before their eyes. Nina let out a strangled whimper, knocking over her chair as she stumbled to her feet. She swayed, her body betraying her as her legs barely held her up. What's happening to me? She rasped. James turned on me then, eyes blazing with something dark, something desperate. What did you do? A slow, bitter laugh curled from my lips. Me? I took a step forward, letting the full weight of my fury, my exhaustion, my relentless will to survive crash down around him. I should be the one asking you that, shouldn't I? His jaw clenched, but there was nowhere for him to run. Not now. Not when the truth was clawing its way to the surface, jagged and raw. Nina slumped against the table, her breath hitching in uneven gasps. James, she croaked, do something. James reached for his phone with shaking hands. I could see the muscles in his jaw flexing, his mind scrambling for some way to spin this, to salvage whatever control he thought he had left. But there was no saving this moment, no talking his way out of it. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. You said it was just supposed to make me sick, right? His fingers froze over the screen. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. I took another step closer, lowering my voice to a near whisper, making sure every syllable landed like a blade against his carefully constructed facade. Just sick enough to miss work. Just sick enough to ruin my reputation. Just sick enough to make me look weak, unreliable. I wonder, how much did you put in this time, James? His nostrils flared. Shut up. Nina let out a strangled cough, her body convulsing slightly. Her hands gripped James's wrist, her nails digging into his skin. James, please. He yanked his hand away from her grasp like she was scalding him. His hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Enough for her to realize. Her eyes, still glossy with panic, snapped to him, filled with something new. Betrayal. You knew, she choked out, her voice raw. You knew it was poisoned. James shook his head too quickly. No, I thought. You thought it was for her, I finished for him, savoring the way his entire body went rigid, the way the truth twisted its knife deeper between them. You thought I'd be the one gasping for breath right now. The weight of my words pressed down on the room, smothering any last flickers of denial. Nina shuddered, her breaths coming in shallow, painful bursts. James, her voice was barely a whisper now. You tried to kill her. I watched him stumble over his own mind, searching for anything to latch onto. The perfect excuse, the right lie. But there was nothing left for him to hide behind. Just the ugly, undeniable truth. And the fact that his own sister had been the one to taste it. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from an unknown number. We have what we need. Sending authorities now. I exhaled slowly, feeling the last pieces of my plan click into place. I had been patient. I had gathered proof. I had waited for them to hang themselves with their own noose. And now, the final act was playing out in front of me. A siren wailed in the distance. James stiffened. His gaze snapped to me, realization crashing over him like a wave of ice. You? Yes, I said simply. His breath hitched. Then, with all the desperation of a cornered animal, he turned, bolting toward the back door. I didn't try to stop him. The police would catch up soon enough. Nina, still trembling, slumped to the floor. Her lips had started to turn a faint shade of blue. I could have called an ambulance. I could have helped her. But as I stared down at her, remembering every whispered insult, every calculated humiliation, every ounce of suffering she had poured into my life, like it was some kind of sport, I just let the sirens come to her instead. I turned my phone's camera toward her one last time, capturing the moment she realized what it felt like to be powerless. This, I murmured, my voice barely audible over the growing wail of approaching justice, is what it feels like to be me. Then I walked out the front door, stepping into the cool evening air, free for the first time in years. And I never looked back. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, the distant wail of sirens echoing through the stillness. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, savoring the quiet before the storm. Then, like clockwork, chaos erupted behind me. Doors slammed, voices raised, boots pounded against the pavement. I turned slowly, just in time to see the first squad car screech to a halt in front of the house. Red and blue lights bathed the pristine white exterior of Nina's home, in violent streaks of color, flashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a warning, a signal that the games were over. James was still running. He had made it past the back gate, his expensive shoes slipping against the damp pavement as he tore through the yard like a man with nowhere left to go. And maybe that was true, because no matter how fast he ran, no matter how many back doors he tried to slip through, he wouldn't escape this. Not anymore. Two officers broke off in pursuit, cutting around the side of the house. James glanced back once, just for a split second, but I saw it. The sheer terror in his eyes, the realization, the moment it all came crashing down on him. He had spent years carefully orchestrating my downfall, but now he was the one running for his life. I stood still, watching as the officers tackled him to the ground. He hit the pavement hard, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as his face pressed against the cold concrete. James Bennett, you are under arrest for attempted poisoning, conspiracy, and assault. You have the right to remain silent. I barely heard the rest. Instead, I turned my attention to Nina. She was still inside, crumpled on the floor beside the dining table. Her body trembled violently, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. An officer was already kneeling beside her, pressing two fingers to her neck, checking her pulse. She's going into shock, he muttered, signaling to the paramedics who had just rushed through the front door. Get the stretcher. Nina turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, but the resentment still burned behind them, buried beneath the pain. You, she rasped, barely able to get the word out. You did this. I crouched down beside her, careful, deliberate. I wanted her to see my face, to remember it. I didn't do anything, Nina, I said, my voice smooth, unshaken. You did this to yourself. Her lips parted, as if to argue, but the pain was too much. Her body seized for a brief second, and then she went limp. The paramedics swarmed around her, lifting her onto the stretcher, securing an oxygen mask over her face. I stepped back, giving them space, my arms folding across my chest as I watched them wheel her out the door. And just like that, the Wilson empire crumbled. It took less than 24 hours for the story to explode. The news broke fast, spreading like wildfire through every social media platform, every television network, every corporate boardroom that had ever entertained James and Nina's presence. A respected businessman and his equally influential sister, accused of attempted poisoning? It was the kind of scandal that devoured reputations overnight. I watched it unfold from the comfort of my own apartment, sipping my tea as reporters dissected every detail. Security footage from the dining room had been leaked, though no one could quite figure out how. The audio was crisp, undeniable. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting. I replayed it again, and again, and again. Each time, my heart beat a little steadier. Each time, my breath came a little easier. They weren't just falling, they were crashing. 2 days later, the inevitable happened. A knock at my door. I took my time answering it, my fingers grazing over the smooth wood, my reflection staring back at me from the glossy surface. When I finally pulled it open, Detective Mendoza stood there, her sharp eyes assessing me with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Respect, maybe. She held out a file. Thought you might want to see this. I took it carefully, flipping it open. Inside were printed documents, transcripts of text messages, emails, conversations between James and Nina, carefully detailing their plan, their reasoning, their justifications. But it was the last page that held my attention. A signed confession. My breath hitched slightly as I skimmed over James's shaky handwriting. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but Nina convinced me it was necessary, that we had to protect the company. That Christina was becoming a threat. A threat. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Well, he wasn't wrong about that, was he? Detective Mendoza smirked. No, he wasn't. I closed the file, exhaling slowly. It was over, truly, finally over. James and Nina would be spending a very long time behind bars, their once perfect world reduced to nothing but shattered glass and whispers of what could have been. And me? I was free. Truly, finally free. As Mendoza turned to leave, she paused at the threshold, glancing back at me. You're going to be okay, you know. I met her gaze, and for the first time in years, I believed it. Yeah, I said softly. I know. And as the door clicked shut behind her, I allowed myself to do something I hadn't done in a very long time. I smiled. The trial began 6 months later. By then, the world had already made up its mind about James and Nina. The evidence was too damning, the confessions too detailed. Their fall from grace was spectacular, a slow motion wreck playing out across every news channel, every social media platform. And yet, even with the weight of their crimes pressing down on them, I knew they weren't done fighting. They still thought they could win. I sat in the courtroom, poised and silent, as their defense attorney wove a flimsy narrative of misunderstanding and regret. James sat stiff-backed in his suit, his hands clasped in his lap, his face carefully neutral. But his eyes, they told a different story. They burned with hatred. For me, Nina, on the other hand, looked wrecked. Her normally perfect hair was limp, her skin sallow. The poisoning had left its mark on her neurological issues, they said. Maybe permanent. She had spent weeks in the hospital, and the time had broken something in her. I could see it in the way she flinched when James moved too quickly beside her, the way her fingers trembled against the polished wooden table. She had finally realized what I had known for years. James only cared about himself. When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand with measured steps, my heartbeat a steady drum in my ears. I had rehearsed this moment, prepared for every question, every attempt to twist my words. James's attorney adjusted his tie, offering me a calculated smile. Miss S. Bennett, you claim that you believed your husband was attempting to poison you. Tell me, why would a man like James, a respected businessman, do such a thing? I met his gaze, unflinching. Because I was in his way. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The attorney chuckled, shaking his head. In his way? Of what? I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch before answering. Of power, of control, of a business deal that would have secured his future, but only if I was out of the picture. I let the words sink in. I saw the jury lean in, saw the way the prosecutor nodded ever so slightly. They believed me. The truth was undeniable. James stiffened in his chair. I could feel his fury radiating across the courtroom, like a coiled snake ready to strike. But there was nothing he could do now. The knife had already been twisted. Nina didn't look at me. She kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched. I had thought she would fight back, that she would try to pin the blame on me somehow, but she didn't. Not this time, because she knew I had already won. The verdict came 2 weeks later. Guilty, on all counts. The judge's voice was steady as she read out the sentences. 20 years for James, 15 for Nina. Conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud. The list went on, each word tightening the noose around their throats. I watched James as the weight of it settled over him. as the reality of what he had done, what he had lost, finally hit. His empire, his status, his carefully crafted reputation, gone. He turned in his seat, his lips parting, as if he wanted to say something. To me. To beg? To threaten? I would never know. Because I stood and walked out without looking back. 1 year later, I found myself standing at the edge of a beach, the cool sand sinking beneath my bare feet. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of deep orange and violet, the waves rolling in a steady, endless rhythm. It had been a long road, a painful one. There were nights when I had woken up in a cold sweat, James's voice still echoing in my ears, his grip still phantom tight around my wrist. There were moments of doubt, of exhaustion, of wondering if I had truly escaped him. But then I would remind myself I had survived. I had won. The scars of the past still lingered, but they no longer controlled me. They no longer defined me. A familiar voice called my name, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned, smiling as I saw Detective Mendoza approaching, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "Didn't take you for a beach person," she mused, stopping beside me. I chuckled. Neither did I. She glanced out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "You did it, you know." I nodded. "Yeah, I did." For a moment, we stood in silence, the wind tangling through my hair, the scent of salt thick in the air. Then Mendoza exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You should know James tried to appeal. Got denied." I smiled. "Good, he's still obsessed with you." My chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. "Let him be." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You're not afraid anymore." "No," I said softly. "I'm not." She patted my shoulder before turning to leave. "Take care, Christina." I watched her go, then turned back to the ocean, the waves licking at my toes. The water was cold, but I stepped forward anyway, letting it wash over me, letting it cleanse away the last remnants of the life I had left behind. James was gone. Nina was gone. And I was free. Truly, finally free. I closed my eyes, breathing in the salt air, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't afraid. I was alive. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Freedom tastes different when you fought for it. For months, I had savored every breath, every quiet morning untouched by fear, every night without the weight of James's presence pressing down on me. I was finally free, truly free. And yet, I wasn't naive enough to believe the past would stay buried forever. The letter came on a Tuesday, postmarked from a federal prison 2 states away. The sight of his handwriting on the envelope sent a shiver down my spine, not fear, but something sharper, something colder. James. I could have burned it, thrown it away, let his words rot with him in that cell, but I didn't. Because I knew what this was. One last move, one last, desperate grasp at control. I took my time opening it, slicing through the paper with a careful precision that felt almost surgical. The letter inside was short, too short for a man like James. He had always been one for grand gestures, dramatic monologues designed to twist the narrative in his favor. This was different. "Christina, you think you've won. You haven't. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. See you soon." That was it. No apology, no pleading, no feigned remorse. Just a warning, a promise, a declaration of war. I exhaled slowly, setting the letter down on the table as I weighed my next move. James had always underestimated me. That was his first mistake, thinking that this letter would shake me, that it would send me spiraling back into paranoia. That was his second. His third? Believing he had any power left at all. I made a call that night. Detective Mendoza answered on the second ring. "Christina," he wrote to me. A pause. A deep inhale. Of course he did. "I assume you already know. Prison monitors all outgoing mail, but they don't stop it unless it's a direct threat. This," she hesitated, "it's meant to unsettle you, to make you feel like he's still in control." It didn't work. She let out a small chuckle. Didn't think it would. How secure is his facility? It's maximum security, Christina. He's not going anywhere. People like James don't need to leave prison to be dangerous. They just need someone willing to act on their behalf. Mendoza sighed. "You think he has someone on the outside?" I think James has spent his whole life making people feel like they owe him something. Silence stretched between us for a moment, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she said, I'll look into it. But you should know he's desperate. That letter proves it. And desperate men make mistakes. I'm counting on it. Days passed. Then weeks. I lived my life as if nothing had changed, but I was watching. Waiting. Looking for the cracks in the world James had left behind. And then, one evening, I found one. It was subtle, just a flicker in the background of my routine. A car parked across the street for too long. A man in a dark jacket lingering outside my building, pretending to check his phone every time I looked his way. They thought they were being careful. They weren't careful enough. I made another call. This time, I didn't wait for the police to handle it. I followed him first. The man in the dark jacket, the shadow James had sent to remind me that he still had reach, still had influence. He wasn't as careful as he should have been. He didn't notice me tailing him when he left his post outside my building. He didn't realize I had memorized his habits, his routine, the way he always checked his surroundings in the exact same order before moving. And he definitely didn't notice me when I cornered him in an alleyway 3 nights later. His breath hitched when he saw me step out of the shadows. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting me. You've been watching me, I said evenly, my voice a quiet blade in the dark. He swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. I tilted my head, studying him. James sent you, didn't he? A flicker of panic. Barely there, but enough. I took a slow step forward. You're not very good at this, but that's not surprising. James was never good at picking the right people. If he were, he wouldn't be where he is now. He took a step back, but the alley was narrow, the brick wall behind him solid and unyielding. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You can lie to me, but you should ask yourself this: do you really think James is worth going down for? Because that's what's about to happen. He blinked rapidly, his mind racing. Then, slowly, he exhaled. And I knew. I had him. I was just supposed to keep tabs on you. That's it. Just report back. To who? My voice was soft, coaxing. He hesitated. Then, finally, he broke. His lawyer. The one handling his appeals. He said James needed leverage. Leverage. I felt something cold settle inside me. Leverage for what? His Adam's apple bobbed. He thinks. He thinks if he can prove you were unstable, that you set him up, he can get a reduced sentence, maybe even walk free. I stared at him, my heartbeat slow, steady. And how was he planning to prove that? The man licked his lips. If something happened to you, if you disappeared. The words hung between us. A sickening truth laid bare. I stepped closer, lowering my voice until it was barely more than a whisper. You're going to do something for me. He swallowed. What? You're going to tell James exactly what he wants to hear. You're going to let him believe his plan is working. And then, when the time is right, I leaned in, my breath ghosting over his ear. You're going to help me destroy him. A long silence. Then, slowly, he nodded. I stepped back, watching as he exhaled shakily, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had chosen the wrong side. James had underestimated me once before. He wouldn't live to make that mistake again. The game was still on, and James thought he was winning. I let him believe it. Days passed, then weeks. My new informant, let's call him the pawn, fed James exactly what he wanted to hear. Reports of my paranoia, my supposed breakdowns, stories of me lashing out at people who got too close, of me losing sleep, of me unraveling at the edges. All of it lies. But James ate it up, desperate to believe that I was on the verge of falling apart. That his long shadow still reached me, still wrapped around my throat like an unseen noose. He was convinced that if he played his cards right, he could use it against me, and I was waiting for him to make his move. It came on a Friday morning. Detective Mendoza called me just before dawn, her voice clipped, urgent. He filed an appeal. I sat up in bed, already reaching for the file I had been keeping evidence he didn't know I had, pieces of the puzzle he thought were hidden. On what grounds? Mental instability. She let the words hang there for a moment before continuing. His lawyer claims that you've been exhibiting signs of psychological distress. That you fabricated the entire poisoning incident to frame him out of spite. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing down the fury bubbling just beneath my ribs. Let me guess. He has witnesses? A few. Paid off, I'd wager, including your new friend. I smiled. A slow, sharp thing. The pawn had done well. Let him think he has the upper hand, I murmured. He's not going to see what's coming. Mendoza exhaled sharply. You're playing a dangerous game, Christina. No, detective, I said, standing and pulling open my dresser drawer, my fingers grazing over the hidden recorder I had been using for months. I'm winning the game. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. James was ready, or so he thought. I walked into the courtroom wearing a deep blue suit, my head held high, my face unreadable. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my skin like a brand. He expected to see me frazzled, fragile. He had no idea that every step I took was measured, every breath deliberate. He had no idea he was walking into his own execution. His lawyer stood, smoothing down his jacket, exuding false confidence. Your Honor, my client has been unfairly imprisoned due to the malicious actions of his ex-wife, who has demonstrated erratic behavior and a personal vendetta. We have evidence to suggest that Miss S. Bennett staged her own poisoning to destroy my client's reputation. I felt the jury stiffen at the accusation. The judge lifted an eyebrow. You have evidence? We do. His lawyer gestured, and the pawn stood from his seat in the audience. He looked nervous. Good. This witness has been observing Miss S. Bennett's actions for the past several weeks, the lawyer continued. He can attest to her aggressive behavior, her instability. James smirked then, a ghost of his former arrogance flickering to life. He thought he had me cornered, that the world would finally see me as the liar he had painted me to be. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. Go ahead, I murmured. Call your witness. The lawyer nodded, beckoning the pawn to the stand. He took his oath, sat down, avoided looking at me. Can you confirm, the lawyer prompted, that you have personally witnessed Miss S. Bennett acting erratically? That she has expressed distress over my client and even admitted to setting him up? A beat of silence. Then the pawn exhaled slowly, laced his fingers together, and said, NOI, cannot. The room went still. The lawyer's face twisted in confusion. James stiffened beside him, fingers curling against the table. Excuse me? The lawyer demanded. The pawn swallowed hard, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, I was asked to observe Miss S. Bennett, yes, but I never saw her exhibit any of the behaviors described. In fact, he paused, taking a shaky breath. I was coerced into lying. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge narrowed his eyes. Explain. The pawn shifted uncomfortably. James Bennett contacted me through an intermediary. He paid me to follow his ex-wife, to make her feel unsafe. Then he instructed me to fabricate claims about her mental state. He wanted me to help discredit her so he could secure an appeal. James surged to his feet. That's a goddamn lie, Mr. Bennett, the judge warned, voice sharp. Sit down. James's hands curled into fists, his face dark with rage. He turned to the pawn, his voice low, dangerous. You're making a mistake. But the pawn wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at me, and I was smiling. The final nail in James's coffin came moments later when I reached into my bag, pulled out my small recording device, and pressed play. James's voice crackled through the speakers, unmistakable. Make her look crazy. If she disappears, even better. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face lit up. Mendoza, standing in the back, folded her arms, nodding to herself. James went pale. It was over. The judge denied the appeal, added 5 more years to James's sentence for conspiracy. The prison warden ensured he was placed in isolation, stripped of the connections he had tried to wield as weapons. His lawyer dropped him as a client. His name, his legacy was reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. And me? I walked out of that courtroom victorious. James had tried to rewrite the story, but he had forgotten one crucial fact. I was the author of this narrative, and I had already written his ending. That night, I stood on my balcony, looking out over the city, breathing in the crisp night air. My phone buzzed. A text from Mendoza. He won't bother you again. I exhaled slowly, my grip loosening, my shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. James had lost, for good this time, And me? I wasn't just free. I was untouchable.